but the head of the third man overpasses the clouds. Then a cross comes out of the tomb, and a voice from heaven asks, "Hast thou preached to them that sleep?" And the cross answers, "Yea." Now these are how real legends look. They're embellished with all sorts of theological and apologetical motifs which are conspicuously lacking from Mark's account, which is stark in its simplicity. Finally, number 5, the earliest Jewish polemic presupposes the empty tomb. In the 28th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew records the story of the guard at the tomb. And what's interesting for our purposes is Matthew's final comment about the guard story. He says, "This story has been spread among Jews until this day." Now, what that shows is that Matthew is concerned to exercise a widespread Jewish rumor or counter-explanation of the disciples' proclamation of Jesus' resurrection from the dead. Now, what were Jews saying in response to the disciples' proclamation, "He is risen from the dead"? That these men are full of new wine? That Jesus' corpse still lies in the tomb in the garden? No, they were saying the disciples came and stole away his body. Now think about that for a minute. The disciples came and stole away his body. The earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of the resurrection was itself an attempt to explain why the body was missing. And thus we have evidence for the fact of the empty tomb, which is absolutely top drawer, because it comes not from the Christians, but from the very opponents of the early Christian movement, who themselves entangled themselves in a hopeless series of absurdities, trying to explain away the fact of the empty tomb. On these 5 grounds, once again, the wide majority of New Testament historians who have written on this subject recognize that, in fact, the tomb of Jesus was discovered empty by a group of his women followers on the Sunday morning after his crucifixion. Fact number 3, on different occasions and under various circumstances, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive from the dead. This is a fact which is universally acknowledged today among New Testament critics, from liberal to conservative. Why? Well, 2 reasons. Number 1, Paul's list of eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection appearances guarantees that such appearances occurred. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul gives a list of witnesses to post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And scholars have shown that Paul is not writing there freely in his own hand. Rather, he is quoting, just as he says, an earlier oral tradition which he himself received and in turn is passing on to the Corinthian church. And this tradition is so old that it has been dated to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Some scholars think it even goes back to within 18 months after the crucifixion. Thus, it cannot be dismissed as some sort of later legendary embellishment. Paul's information makes it certain that there were individuals and groups of people about, still alive, who claimed to have seen Jesus risen from the dead. Secondly, the appearance narratives in the Gospels give multiple independent attestation of these appearances. Once again, the appearance stories are not found just in a single source, but we have early independent sources for these resurrection appearances of Jesus. And for that reason, all historical scholars are united in the view that after the crucifixion of Jesus, different individuals and groups of people claim to have seen appearances of Jesus alive after his death. Finally, number 4, the original disciples suddenly and sincerely came to believe that Jesus was risen from the dead, despite having every predisposition to the contrary. Think of the situation the disciples faced following Jesus' crucifixion. Number one, their leader was dead, and Jewish messianic expectations had no idea of a Messiah who, instead of triumphing over Israel's enemies, would be humiliatingly executed by them as a criminal. Messiah was supposed to come and restore the throne of David in Jerusalem and rule over Jew and Gentile alike. A Messiah who failed to throw off Israel's enemies, in this case Rome, and failed to reign, was a contradiction in terms. Secondly, the Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead to glory and immortality before the resurrection at the end of the world. Jewish beliefs about the resurrection of the dead was that at the end of the world, on the judgment day, God would raise all the righteous dead, or all of Israel, to judgment and then determine their final destiny. But there was no concept in Judaism of a resurrection of an isolated individual which appeared within history prior to the end of the world. So, confronted with the crucifixion of Jesus, at most all the disciples could have done would be to simply preserve Jesus' tomb as a shrine where his bones might reside in an ossuary or a bone box until the resurrection at the end of the world, when they and all the righteous dead of Israel would be reunited with their master in the kingdom of God. But they wouldn't, as first century Jews, have come to believe that he was already risen from the dead, in contradiction to Jewish beliefs. And therefore, the question is, how do you explain the origin of the disciples' belief that Jesus was in fact risen from the dead? Now, these are the facts. These are not opinions that are simply the views of conservative scholars. These represent the conclusions of the broad mainstream of historical scholarship today. Now, this puts the skeptical critic in a rather desperate situation. For now you have to ask the question, how do you best explain these facts? And that leads to our second point, that the best explanation of these facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. And here I would argue that the resurrection hypothesis meets all of the standard criteria for being the best explanation. It has great explanatory scope. It explains all four of those facts that I mentioned. It has great explanatory power. It provides sufficient explanation for why each of these occurred. It is plausible. It is not ad hoc or contrived. It is in accord with accepted beliefs, and it far outstrips any of its rival theories in meeting conditions 1 to 5, as our skit, I think, so nicely illustrated this evening. Now, what's the critic supposed to say at this point? Well, I had a very interesting debate a few years ago at the University of California in Irvine on the historicity of Jesus' resurrection with a professor who had written his doctoral dissertation on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. He could not deny the facts of Jesus' honorable burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, or the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection from the dead. And so his only recourse was to come up with some alternative explanation of these facts. And so he argued that Jesus of Nazareth must have had an unknown identical twin brother who was separated from him at birth and nobody knew about. He came back to Jerusalem just at the time of the crucifixion, stole his brother's body out of the tomb, presented himself to the disciples, who mistakenly inferred that Jesus was risen from the dead. Now, I'm not going to go into how I went about refuting this theory, but I think it's instructive because it shows to what desperate lengths skepticism must go in order to explain away the evidence. In fact, did you know that the evidence is so good that one of the world's leading Jewish theologians, the late Pinchas Lapid, who taught at Hebrew University in Israel, declared himself convinced on the basis of the evidence that the God of Israel raised Jesus of Nazareth from the dead. So I think we have very good grounds historically for affirming the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Now, if I might wrap up at this point, I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks this evening that there are really two avenues to a knowledge of Jesus' resurrection, the experiential and the historical. And I think we've seen that there are good grounds historically for believing in Jesus' resurrection. But I think it's also possible to know that Jesus is risen wholly apart from historical arguments through having an immediate experience of the risen Lord. And this is what happened to me. I myself wasn't raised in a Christian home or even a church-going family. But as a teenager, I began to ask the big questions in life. Why am I here? Who am I? What's the meaning of my existence? And in the search for answers to these questions, I began to attend a church in our local community. But instead of answers, all I found was a social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate. And the other students who went to high school with me and pretended to be such good Christians on Sunday lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And they would do anything in order to be popular. And this really bothered me because I thought, here I am so spiritually empty inside, but externally, I'm leading a better life than they are, and they claim to be Christians. They're all just a pack of hypocrites. They're all phonies. They must be just as spiritually empty as I am, but they're all putting up a false front to the world, pretending to be something they're really not. And so I began to become very bitter and angry toward the people in the institutional church. And soon this attitude began to spread toward other people. As I looked at other people, I thought they're all fakes. They're all phonies. Everybody is holding up a plastic mask to the world, and the real person is cowering down inside, afraid to come out and be real. And so I began to withdraw from other people. I said, I don't need other people. I hate them because of their phoniness and hypocrisy. I don't want anything to do with them. And so I threw myself into my studies, and I shunned relationships with other people because I said I despised them. I was on my way, frankly, toward becoming a very alienated young man. And yet, in moments of honesty and introspection, when I looked into my own heart, I knew that deep down inside, I really did want to love and to be loved by other people. And I realized in that moment that I was just as much a phony as they were. Because here I was, putting on this bravado, this brave front, pretending I don't need other people, when deep down inside I knew I really did. And so that anger turned in on myself for my own phoniness and hypocrisy. And I don't know if you understand what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just gnaws away at your insides, making every day miserable, another day to get through. Well, one day I was feeling particularly crummy, and I walked into my high school German class, and I sat down behind a girl who's one of these types, you know, that's always so happy, it just makes you sick. And she turned, I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said to her, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, well, Bill, it's because I'm saved. And I said, you're what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ is my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that thought just hit me like a ton of bricks.